Welcome back. We're talking to Lauren Booth today on Hiwar Khas, on Special Dialogue. Lauren, before the break, you talked about your arrival at Gaza on board the ships and what you saw in terms of the health sector, the education sector, the impact of the siege on those particular sectors. And obviously, you know, we can talk about all sorts of stuff, about employment, about sanitation, about all these issues. But one of the arguments that the other side often presents is that, well, this is partly of the Palestinians' making. I mean, the infighting between either Hamas and Fatah, the instability of the government and all this. You met the Prime Minister Ismail Haniyeh in Gaza. What was your take, as an outsider, someone who's unrelated, unbiased, you know, what was your take on the political situation and how much that had to do with the whole problem in Gaza?
I want to respond to the first part of your question, which is that to many in the outside world and certainly to the Western media, somehow Gazans have brought this on themselves by voting for radical extremists. This is the language of the Western media. Well, I'd like to say that collective punishment is actually illegal under international law. So no matter who you vote for, why should a child be forced into a malnourished state because of the actions of a parliament that perhaps their mother didn't even vote for? This is not how international law works. So that's the first thing to recognise, that the majority of Gazans, 61%, are under 18 years old. So these are not voters, okay? So let's take that out. Yes, I went over as a totally impartial member of a group with no political affiliations. This is very important. And we chose, some of us as individuals, to meet with Ismail Haniyeh because he is the Prime Minister of the region. And so how did I find the situation there? I find it incredible that, you know, a government that is elected under a democratic process can be shunned in this way and used to punish its own people. It's certainly not the case that Hamas is punishing its own people, nor is it the case that Hamas is sealing the borders. I often hear on news bulletins Israeli spokespeople saying it's Hamas who is starving its people, it's Hamas who is closing the borders. That's not the case. We need to be very clear about this. Israel controls all the borders around Gaza. When we talk about withdrawal, they might have got rid of the settlements, but nobody comes and goes without Israel's permission, and nothing comes into Gaza without it going through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Israel. Within that, I thought that Hamas is certainly respected on the ground. As making, let me finish that sentence. Is respected for making it, Gaza a safer place for citizens to walk around and dwell. Because when there was talk of lawlessness a few years ago, there were armed gangs. There was the Dogmush family, a criminal fraternity responsible for kidnapping Alan Johnson. And there was a war almost when I was in Gaza between this very armed clan and the Hamas police. And the Hamas police have stopped it, and all the individuals and the families that I spoke to said, "Oh, we're free. We're free now to go around our business, to see our families at night, not to be under curfew from the criminal element." So in that way, Hamas is respected by the people for making it safer. Now, not all people are Hamas affiliated. Not all the people are Fatah affiliated. What you've got are civilians there with the right to choose either group. There is a schism between Gaza and the West Bank now. I'm very, very sad to say that. And if there's one message that the individuals in Gaza said to me, said, call for unity, please, dear Lord, tell the outside world and tell our own leaders to call for unity.
You were then prevented from leaving when you thought, you know, your time was up and you wanted to go back home. But you found yourself trapped. Tell us a little about that.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about the Rafah crossing because obviously people will know that the Erez crossing is controlled by Israel and you go from Gaza through Israel to the West Bank. Well, you can't now. If you're an adult Gazan over 18 years, you will never go through that crossing. So the West Bank is completely out of bounds. Any of your family, any of your routes, any of your work, that's not happening. So the route to the west of the world for Gazans has only been through Rafah. Now this year the Rafah crossing into Egypt has only been opened for 8 days. Can you
throughout
imagine?
The entire year?
Throughout the entire year. 8 days through the entire year. So that's like the population, 1.5 million people who cannot leave, have no exit. And going to Rafah, even when it's open, even when you've got the right papers and this mysterious coordination, you've got to have coordination to go to Rafah. Nobody knows quite how you get it. There's systems in place. You go with your passport, as I did. I presented it to the authorities there, and they looked and they went, "You were on the boat. You're not leaving." I said, "I'm sorry, this isn't the Israeli checkpoint, this is Egypt, isn't it?" And then they went very quiet. And a political decision had been made to punish the people on board the boat, to humiliate us, to make us feel, well, if you're in solidarity with the Gazan people, see what it feels to be under siege like the Gazan people. And I'm very ashamed to tell you that this collaboration was in part, down to Egypt. They were agreeing with the policies and obeying their masters, their political masters in Egypt, in Israel. And I've seen this with my own eyes.
So what does it come down to? How ultimately, what kind of steps or measures were taken during that time? I understand that the British consulate were hard at work trying to secure your release from Gaza. What did it come down to?
Well, if you don't mind, before we move on to that, it's very important for people to realise that the Egyptian government, quite how they are making life difficult for Gazans with their choices. Because at the moment there are tunnels. Everybody knows that there's the Gazan people call them the Gazan subway. Yes. And often this is more increasingly the only way that medical aid is getting through is by these tunnels underneath the Rafah crossing, which, as I've said, is closed. And I've heard, now I can't actually prove this, but I've heard that recently the Egyptians gassed one of the tunnels, killing 6 civilians. Now, the only people who use these tunnels, the only people who really need to use the tunnels, people in need of medical aid, families who've been split up and can't see each other. So there, I believe that if 6 people died in the tunnels, the Gazan people believe these were civilians. Now, that's being done by the Egyptian government against the Palestinian people. Let's have some explanation for that. My situation, when I was turned away, it was a political decision. There's nothing wrong with my papers. I'm a member of the world's press, I'm a British citizen, but I could still be turned away and trapped in this place. And no matter who I contacted, they said, Israel are controlling the borders and they don't want you to leave. I said, well, what about Egypt? Israel are controlling the borders and they don't want you to leave. And Egypt is doing what it's told. And eventually enough noise was made and I was able to leave. But I left behind 1.5 million people who are still being punished.
Which of the border lines did you cross? Was it through
Rafah? I would not go through Erez.
Now, I mean, this brings me to a very quite a frustrating issue, and that is the issue of how the people of Gaza and Palestine generally feel in regards with the kind of support they are receiving from their Arab brothers, either the governments or even, the help from the people, throughout the Arab world. Essentially, the people who broke the siege were by far and large non-Arabs, apart from 1 or 2 members possibly, but the vast majority were non-Arabs. And that played quite heavily in the Arab media that reported the arrival of the ships, that essentially it was the non-Arab world that broke the siege on Gaza. Now, what did you hear from the people on the ground in Gaza about this?
There's a couple of points to address here. First and foremost, if those boats had been laden with Arab supporters, and there are Arab supporters and family members from around the world who are very concerned about Palestine, if those boats had been filled with Arabs, they would have been at risk.